Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, everyone, welcome back. We're diving deep today, and it's going to be a fascinating one, I think. We're looking at the relationship between the Nation of Islam and the Black Power movement during the Civil Rights era.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? On the surface, you've got both the Nation of Islam, or as many know them, the NOI, and the Black Power movement, and they're fighting for similar things like Black pride, and self-determination.
Right, fighting for the same things, but
But
yeah.
when you look closer,
Yeah.
they had different methods.
Uh-huh.
And some of their core beliefs were actually pretty different, especially when you start thinking about things like cultural identity and how to even achieve equality.
Okay, so we've got a pretty big stack of sources here, articles, historical accounts. We've even got some firsthand accounts
Wow.
that dig deep into how these two movements, kind of intertwined.
Intertwined, yeah.
One of the things that really jumped out at me was how the NOI, which was founded, way back in the 1930s,
Oh, yeah.
actually laid a lot of the groundwork for the more radical Black Power movement
It did.
that emerged in the 60s.
It's true. The NOI was active decades before the Black Power movement even started gaining momentum.
Right.
And it wasn't just the timing. The NOI, under Elijah Muhammad's leadership, had this very specific philosophy, like built on some strong principles. We're talking Black separatism, self-sufficiency, and just a straight-up rejection of white cultural influence.
Yeah, and they, put those principles into practice.
They did.
This wasn't just talk. They built a whole network of Black-owned businesses,
Right.
grocery stores, restaurants. They even had a bank.
They did, yeah.
I mean, this really set a precedent for Black Power's focus on economic empowerment later on,
Right, and that idea of a separate Black nation,
Yeah.
either within the U.S. or even outside of it.
Wow.
That was a big part of their platform. Elijah Muhammad truly believed that Black Americans could only achieve real freedom and autonomy
Yeah.
if they separated entirely from white society.
It's a powerful concept, and it resonated with a lot of people,
It did.
especially, folks who were just disillusioned with the slow pace of change during the Civil Rights movement.
Absolutely. It's like they were creating a blueprint for Black empowerment,
Right.
like from the ground up.
Yeah.
And it definitely resonated with Black Power advocates in the 60s.
Yeah.
That emphasis on self-reliance, economic independence, building up Black communities from within,
Yes.
that was a powerful message, especially for a generation coming of age during such a turbulent time.
For sure. Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
And historians use this term, Black nationalism, to describe this ideology
They do.
that emphasizes Black pride, self-determination,
Right.
and often the creation of independent Black political and economic institutions.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because while both the NOI and Black Power advocates were proponents of Black nationalism,
Yeah.
there were key differences in how they envisioned it.
There-
So let's unpack that a little. Where did the NOI and the Black Power movement diverge when it came to Black nationalism? What were some of those, key differences?
Well, a major point of divergence was their views on African cultural heritage.
Okay.
The Black Power movement and groups like the Black Panther Party in particular
Okay.
were all about reclaiming
Right.
and celebrating these visual symbols of African heritage,
Mhm.
natural afros, colorful African clothing styles.
I see.
It was about connecting with their ancestral roots and expressing their identity
Okay.
in a way that had been suppressed for centuries.
Right. It was about taking pride in their heritage and rejecting the Eurocentric standards
Nice.
of beauty and culture that had been imposed on them.
Exactly. But Elijah Muhammad and the NOI,
Yeah.
they had a very different perspective.
Interesting.
He actually saw those expressions of African culture as primitive. He actually said,
Oh, wow.
I have a quote from him where he says, "I am already civilized and I am ready to civilize Africa."
Wait, seriously, he wanted to civilize Africa. I mean, I understand that the NOI was focused on uplift and progress, but that's a pretty loaded statement, isn't it?
It is, and it really highlights that friction that existed between these two movements.
Yeah.
For a lot of Black Power advocates, reconnecting with African culture was essential to rebuilding a positive Black identity,
Right.
a sense of pride in their heritage.
Right.
But for Elijah Muhammad, it was like he felt Black Americans were already beyond that,
Okay.
that they were moving towards something new and distinct.
So you've got this interesting dynamic. On
Yeah.
one hand, you've got the NOI, And they were hugely influential in shaping the ideas of Black nationalism
They were.
that fueled the Black Power movement. They were pioneers in advocating for a distinct Black identity and pushing for economic self-sufficiency.
Right.
But on the other hand,
Yeah.
their stance on African cultural heritage created this real point of tension.
It did, and that difference in outlook also played out in their approaches to activism, too. Think about the Black Panthers.
Yeah.
Very public and confrontational in their activism.
Mm-hmm.
They organized armed patrols to monitor police behavior in Black communities,
Oh.
challenging racial injustice head-on.
So they were ready to fight back against oppression and demand their rights?
Exactly. But the NOI, they were much more disciplined, inward-looking.
Yes.
Their focus was on strengthening the Black community
Mm-hmm.
from the inside out through self-improvement, moral discipline, and economic empowerment.
Right.
They weren't about engaging in direct confrontations with the white establishment.
So it's fascinating how two movements with such similar goals could have such vastly different methods for achieving them.
It is, absolutely.
And this brings us to a really important figure who kind of bridges these two movements in a fascinating way. Stokely Carmichael.
Oh, absolutely.
Stokely Carmichael, he's like a key player in the Black Power movement.
He is.
He's the one who popularized the term Black Power, right?
Yeah, he is. And Carmichael was deeply influenced by the NOI's message of self-sufficiency.
Okay.
He often cited them as a major inspiration for his own thinking.
I see.
And when he famously coined the term Black Power in a 1966 speech, it was this electrifying call
Right.
for Black Americans to take control of their own communities, their own destinies.
And that call to action, it really resonated with the NOI's emphasis on self-help and economic empowerment, right?
It did.
It was about building Black businesses, Black schools, creating a strong, independent Black community.
It was. And you can really see how the NOI's groundwork laid the foundation for this kind of thinking. They were pioneers in putting these ideas into action.
Yeah.
Of course, Carmichael's vision of Black Power went beyond just economic empowerment.
Right.
He saw it as a much broader movement for political and social change,
Okay.
encompassing issues like education, healthcare, and housing.
So even though there were these cultural differences, especially around African heritage, both the NOI and Black Power shared this fundamental belief.
They did.
In the power of Black unity and self-determination,
Yes.
they both offered a powerful alternative to their more integrationist approach
They did.
of the mainstream civil rights movement. They were saying, we're going to define our own path on our own terms.
Exactly. And that's a really powerful legacy that continues to resonate today.
It is. Now, before we get into the lasting impact of these movements and the fascinating story of Malcolm X, who I think embodies this whole conversation in a really profound way.
Oh, absolutely. Malcolm X's journey is key to understanding this whole dynamic.
Let's take a quick pause to refresh, and then we'll dive right into Malcolm X's story and unpack the complicated legacy of the NOI and Black Power.
Malcolm X's life, yeah, it really is fascinating, like a lens to view this
Yeah.
whole era.
Yeah.
He went from a prominent voice for the NOI to, becoming a powerful advocate for Black self-worth
Yeah.
and ultimately, a more inclusive vision of humanity.
Right.
Quite a journey.
It is, and it perfectly highlights those connections and divergences between the NOI and Black Power that we've been talking about.
Exactly.
So to really get his impact, I think we got to go back to the beginning.
Right. So let's go back to the early 1950s. Malcolm X rises to prominence, charismatic minister, spokesperson for the NOI.
Okay.
He fully embraces their message of Black separatism, self-reliance, and he quickly becomes one of their most powerful orators.
Yeah, he was known for his really fiery speeches, right?
Well,
Didn't
yes.
shy away from controversy or anything.
Exactly. He had this incredible ability to connect with Black audiences, especially those who were frustrated with the slow pace of change during the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
He wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo, speak truth to power, even if it meant going against what was considered acceptable at the time.
So he's this powerful voice for the NOI, really putting their ideas about Black nationalism on the map. But then in 1964, he makes a dramatic break from the organization.
He did.
That must have been a huge turning point for him.
It was a pivotal moment, yeah, not just for him, as his personal life, but also in the evolution of Black Power ideology.
What led to that break, though? What caused him to, start questioning the NOI's teachings after being such a devoted advocate?
Well, it was a lot of things, Malcolm X started having these disagreements with Elijah Muhammad,
Okay.
particularly over the NOI's stance on political involvement. and their response to events like the assassination of President Kennedy.
So it sounds like he was kind of starting to feel like the NOI's strict separatist approach and their refusal to engage in the political system were limiting their ability to actually achieve real change.
Exactly.
I got it.
Plus, his travels abroad, especially his pilgrimage to Mecca, exposed him to a much more diverse and inclusive understanding of Islam.
Oh, wow.
He encountered Muslims of all races and nationalities, which had challenged the NOI's doctrine of black superiority.
So that must have been a really profound experience for him, seeing firsthand that Islam transcended those racial boundaries.
It was transformative. It significantly broadened his worldview. He realized that the fight for black liberation was actually interconnected with a larger struggle for human rights.
Right.
And dignity.
Indignant.
That encompassed all people.
So how did this shift in thinking kind of manifest itself in his later work? How did his approach to black empowerment actually change?
You start to see it in his speeches and writings after he leaves the NOI.
Okay.
He's still advocating for black empowerment, but his focus kind of shifts from separatism to self-determination within the context of a broader movement for social justice.
Okay.
He starts emphasizing the need for black people to control their own communities and destinies.
Right.
But he also stresses the importance of building alliances with other oppressed groups.
So he's saying, we need to uplift ourselves, but we also need to recognize our shared humanity and work together to create a more just world for everyone.
Precisely. And that message, his evolution towards a more inclusive vision of social justice, had a profound impact on the Black Power movement, even after his assassination in 1965.
Yeah, it's almost like he planted those seeds of change that continued to grow and influence the movement even when he wasn't there anymore.
Absolutely. His ideas about black pride, self-respect, and the need to address systemic injustice, they resonated.
Yeah.
They really resonated with Black Power activists. They took inspiration from his courage, like his intellectual rigor and just his unwavering commitment to black liberation.
So even though his time as a leader was cut short, his legacy became a powerful force, within the Black Power movement, pushing it in new directions.
Yes.
Inspiring activists to think more broadly about their goals and strategies.
Absolutely. Now, as we kind of shift to the lasting impact of both the NOI and the Black Power movement, it's important to remember they both contributed so much to shaping black identity and activism in the U.S.
They laid the groundwork for future generations of activists and thinkers, but they definitely had distinct approaches, distinct legacies, right?
They did. So let's kind of break it down.
Yeah.
The NOI, with their focus on black separatism, self-reliance, and moral discipline, created a strong sense of community and instilled this deep sense of pride and self-worth in many black Americans. Their emphasis on economic empowerment through black-owned businesses was groundbreaking, and it continues to inspire efforts towards black economic self-sufficiency today.
They were pioneers in that. Proving that black communities could build their own institutions and thrive independently.
Right. And the Black Power movement, while embracing a lot of the NOI's core principles, broadened the scope of black liberation to encompass a wider range of issues, from education and healthcare to political representation and criminal justice reform.
So they were less about separating from white society and more about demanding equality and inclusion within it.
Exactly. And their legacy can be seen in everything from the Black Lives Matter movement to the ongoing fight for voting rights and police accountability.
So when we zoom out and look at the big picture, what are the key takeaways for our listeners about the relationship between these two movements? What's the most important thing for them to remember?
I think the biggest takeaway is that their relationship was complex and multifaceted. They shared a commitment to black empowerment and a belief in the power of black unity and self-determination, but they had very different views about how to achieve those goals, especially when it came to cultural identity and political engagement.
So they were both essential parts
of
the broader struggle for black liberation, but they offered distinct pathways.
Yes.
And sometimes those paths diverged.
Yeah, and those points of tension, those disagreements, they're actually what make studying this period so fascinating.
Right.
They challenge us to grapple with the nuances of history, to understand that there are always multiple perspectives and multiple approaches to social change.
Yeah, it's a reminder that progress isn't always linear. There are setbacks, detours, and internal debates that shape the course of any movement.
Right, and those debates, those internal struggles, they're just as important to understand as the external forces that movements are fighting against.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I think it's really important to address the question that's probably on everyone's mind. How might the course of the civil rights movement have been different if the NOI and Black Power had presented a more unified front on issues like cultural identity?
Ah, the million-dollar question.
Right.
It's impossible to know for sure, but it is a thought-provoking exercise.
It is.
Maybe a stronger alliance between the two movements could have led to even more significant progress,
Yeah.
amplified their message, and mobilized a larger segment of the Black community.
Yeah, maybe their combined resources and influence could have exerted more pressure on the political system, led to quicker, more sweeping reforms.
Yeah, it's possible. Or maybe those differences were just too big to overcome.
Right. Perhaps their unique approaches, even with those points of tension, allowed them to reach and inspire a wider range of people,
Yeah,
contributing to the richness and diversity of the Black freedom struggle.
that's a great point. It's a good reminder that social movements, they're rarely monolithic.
Yeah.
They're made up of individuals with diverse experiences and perspectives, and those differences can both strengthen and challenge the movement
Right.
as a whole.
That's a dynamic that we see play out like time and time again throughout history, and it's something we can all learn from as we, engage in social justice movements today.
Absolutely.
So as we conclude this part of our deep dive, what final thoughts would you like to leave our listeners with?
Spending time with all this material, one thing that really stands out to me as well, it's the impact, the lasting impact of both the NOI and the Black Power movement. They really changed things for Black activism in America.
Yeah, they shifted the whole landscape. I think their biggest legacy, though, is that focus on, Black self-determination.
Yeah.
Like this powerful idea that, Black people have the right and the ability to control their own destinies, to define their own identities,
Right.
build their own institutions.
That's about agency.
Yeah, it's about agency, like taking ownership of your own narrative
Exact.
and fighting for what you believe in,
Yeah,
regardless of what, the mainstream might say.
absolutely. And that spirit, it's woven into so many aspects of Black life today. You see it in the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah.
The push for economic justice,
Uh-huh.
educational equality,
Uh-huh.
the celebration of Black art and culture.
It's about reclaiming power, right? You're shaping your own future.
Exactly.
And it makes me think about how differently the NOI and Black Power went about this.
Right.
The NOI was so focused on building from within.
They were.
Like with those Black-owned businesses we talked about.
Yes.
Almost creating a world apart.
Right. They really believed in establishing those parallel institutions,
Yeah.
and fostering that deep sense of self-reliance within the Black community.
Yeah.
And while Black Power shared that goal of empowerment, their approach was, it was more about demanding change from existing power structures,
Right.
They wanted to dismantle systemic racism and gain full inclusion in American society.
So two different paths towards a similar goal.
Exactly.
I think both approaches were so vital, though.
They were.
The NOI proved that Black communities could thrive independently,
Yeah.
while Black Power forced the nation to actually confront its inequalities, those deep-seated inequalities.
And it's interesting to consider how those different tactics played out.
Yeah.
The NOI, with their emphasis on discipline and moral uprightness,
Right.
attracted a lot of people who were seeking structure and community,
Yeah.
and their message really resonated in urban areas,
Mhm. Yeah.
offering a path away from poverty and crime.
And I mean, their impact is undeniable.
Oh, yeah.
Just think about all those prominent figures that came out of the NOI, Muhammad Ali, even Malcolm X. And, Black Power's more confrontational approach, while sometimes controversial,
Yep.
it shined a light on police brutality,
Yeah.
economic disparities, the need for political representation.
Right.
Their activism pushed these issues into the national spotlight and spurred those important conversations about racial justice,
Absolutely.
It's a reminder that there's not just one way to fight for equality.
Right.
Sometimes you got to build from within, and sometimes you got to challenge the status quo head on.
Yeah, absolutely. And both the NOI and Black Power, they contributed to this broader understanding of what Black liberation could actually look like.
Yeah.
They helped pave the way for a more nuanced and, multifaceted approach to activism and social change.
And I think that's the key takeaway for our listeners today.
It is.
These movements weren't just historical footnotes.
No,
Their legacies are alive,
they are.
Inspiring generations of activists, artists, and thinkers who are still fighting for racial justice and equality.
And they remind us that history, Well, history is not just something we read about in textbooks.
Right.
It's a living force that shapes our present and influences our future. Understanding these movements with all their, complexities and contradictions
Yeah.
gives us a much deeper appreciation for this ongoing struggle for Black empowerment.
So we're wrapping up our deep dive today, but we encourage you to keep exploring these movements.
Yes.
Continue learning about their impact, and I think most importantly, reflect on how their legacies resonate in your own life and community.
Stay curious,
Yeah.
Ask questions and always remember that history is full of lessons that can guide us as we work towards a more just and equitable world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We hope you've learned some new things today, and, it sparked your curiosity to keep learning.
And keep digging.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.